Definitely.
Good evening. So, hello everybody, and welcome to this week's 120 Dublin Stories with Santa Rita and the Little Museum. And tonight I'm delighted to be joined by Finbarr Whooley, the Director of Content with the Museum of London. Finbarr has been both a friend and an advisor to us in the Little Museum over the last number of years. He's very kindly shared his advice running a city museum of, must be said, a different scale. But Finbarr, it's lovely to have you here, so thank you so much.
Not at all my pleasure. And what you didn't say was a great fan, because I think it's one of the best museums anywhere. So I'm a great fan.
Very, very much appreciated. That's very kind of you. It's so for everyone joining us this evening, if you've got questions for Finbarr at any point, please type them into the chat function and we'll get through them as we go through the session. But Finbarr, I'm going to jump in and just ask you to give us a bit of an introduction to the Museum of London to those who haven't been with you before.
Sure. The Museum of London is the museum that looks at I suppose it's fairly obvious. It says it on the tin. We're based near St. Paul's by the Barbican. We have it's quite an extensive museum. We have some 1 million objects in our collection, and we have not to be outdone on that, we also have an archaeological archive with about another 5 million artifacts in that. We're based on 3 sites. The main site is London Wall, and the other site is the Museum of London Docklands, and then we also have an archaeological archive where all those other millions of archaeological archives are kept. I suppose we get about 1 million visitors a year, roughly, and we draw those visitors from both London, from the rest of the UK, and from abroad.
Okay, I don't envy your archivist's job. It must be said. I really don't. But it's an amazing collection of that scale. And you mentioned that you have a couple of different museum sites. Does your mission and do your audiences differ based on the different locations?
That's an interesting question. London Wall is, in a way, our mission stands for across all our sites. And in a way, put simply, we have to reflect London to Londoners themselves. We have definitely a role nationally. There's the relationship with the rest of the UK, but importantly, we are the sort of face of London to the tourists. About 50% of our visitors are tourists. And to your point about the sites, it's an interesting one. Museum of London Docklands is set in a historic warehouse in the Docklands. Very much, I would say it's a local regional museum with some quite important international collections. It has a strong collection relating to the international slave trade, but it very much has a focus that probably draws from the 5 local boroughs, whereas the London Wall site is probably more, it draws from across London and internationally.
And you and I were speaking earlier this week, and when you were talking to me about the guests coming into the museum, and you spoke to me about this idea of a guest who has this imagined London and how that's a really important thing. You might explain that idea.
I mean, to a certain extent, I would say actually that Dublin and London are very similar in the sense that they're both places of reality and they're places of the imagination, because there are people who have never been to Dublin and never been to London, who have come across these cities in literature or in film. And one of the things I'm quite interested in is how we represent not just real London, but the London of people's imagination. And when you think about it today, everything from Paddington Bear through to the James Bond franchise, London is increasingly a sort of it plays a role itself. It's in the on the and it has its own persona, and in many ways one of the things we do is, I suppose, how to what extent does the museum engage with that sort of that view of the imagination. One example I would give you is that we did an exhibition some years ago on the London of Sherlock Holmes, and we had extraordinary interest from Japan because in Japan, because, put simply, Sherlock Holmes is very big in Japan, and that's sort of very bit weird, because actually these might be people who would never ever come, but we certainly had a lot of online interest. We tried to organize a touring exhibition. It fell through in the end because just of practicalities. But Japan was the place where there was a particular interest. So yeah, it's sort of an interesting one.
That's an interesting one. I would dare say, as a Harry Potter enthusiast, that may be another one too.
Oh yes, definitely.
And one idea that we think about and we talk about quite a lot in the Little Museum, and it must be a challenge that, or a question that you guys would ask yourselves a lot as well, is this idea that when you're curating exhibitions, does it need to appeal to each of these audiences simultaneously, or is it okay to engage different subjects with different audiences?
I think our museum is generally entrance is free, but our special exhibitions are ticketed. So I suppose I mean, this is a regular challenge and a conversation we have internally all the time. Is that are you increasingly museums are very scientific about how they sort of follow the world of marketing, and they look to sort of being very, very focused in developing their content. I'm sufficiently old school to say that there is yes, of course you have to be targeted, but I think you miss a lot of the museum experience if you overly target for one audience. There is something which, and I know some of my colleagues hate it when I say this, but there is a general visitor. There's somebody who just comes in and wanders in. And so I think so for instance, with our we did an exhibition I was very proud of a couple of years ago called the Crime Museum Uncovered. It was a partnership project we did with the Metropolitan Police, with the collection that used be known in the past as the Black Museum. So this is some really gruesome stuff. So we had access to their entire collection, which then we re-curated. And it was very interesting because there was a lot of internal discussions about saying, what's the right audience for this? Who's going to be offended? And it's really interesting because, of course, the first thing that I learned, which you may well know with a perhaps a more sharpened view of as a ticket museum, you may be sharper on this, but crime is the sort of guilty secret largely of women. So the people who true crime, for instance, is something that you have a lot more women come to. So for that exhibition we had there were some quite interesting things. So there were the people who we expected. So we got a women's a special sort of women audience. We got a much broader demographic socially. A lot more blue collar people came to visit it. And of course, but interestingly, and this is the thing coming back to your point, is that there were quite a lot of families came to it. And I had been, and so a lot of my colleagues were saying, well, we really, families will not go near this with a barge pole because it's quite grim. And actually that wasn't the case. So yeah, there is targeting. In my long-winded answer to you, I'm sorry. There is targeting, but it's sort of, I like to temper it by also thinking that there is there are things that just capture people's imagination.
And I think when you're talking about families, we seem to sometimes find kids like gruesome, and that
They definitely do. They definitely
adds
do.
to the fun. It's but I think this whole idea that you're saying that, you know, you're bringing in very diverse audiences to actually engage with the museum, I think that's really, in the Little Museum's opinion, that's a really important thing when it comes to the role of a city museum, that if we're not opening our doors in a way that is accessible and of interest or curiosity to diverse audiences, you know, kind of from our perspective, we kind of think, well, what are we doing? And, you know, I kind of wonder, how do you think about this idea of the role of a city museum?
It's a very interesting question, because I think city museums have a responsibility to the people who live in the city, in that city. They have to be accessible. It's not a neither or. There are arguments about lots of different types of museums and how you can specialize, but it seems to be inconceivable that you would be a museum of a city and not be aware, and that everyone who lives in that city should have some sort of a buy-in. And that's, of course, the sort of the holy grail of lots of museums these days. I think and in my case, as a publicly funded museum, it would be outrageous for us not to aspire to being accessible to everyone in the community. Easier said than done, but I think it's something that, certainly in my case, I think I've often said to people over the years that and this is something that I think you guys do incredibly well, is that you can nuance your content forever about making sure that it's just, you know, it's just accessible. The reading level is right. The sort of your choices of your objects are, you know, work at so many levels. But if you don't get the front door right, you can just forget it. If you don't get the welcome, if you don't get the sense of, do you know what, this is a really cool place to walk into, and I'm not anxious, and I'm not worried, and I'm not afraid by it, and I don't feel intimidated, then you can forget all the rest of the stuff. If you don't get that sort of first person interaction, which, as I say, I think the nature of the Little Museum, you do that very, very well, because there is that sort of there's a human interaction, isn't there? And I think that's one of the really key things that museums are getting better at, but we're not there yet, I think.
And well, thank you for saying that. And I think, yeah, from our own perspective, I think the element of human engagement and the fact that there is someone with a smile to greet you, and that our team are there, they're happy to meet you, and they want to be there, and they want to share their stories, and we're all collectively really proud of our city. And I think that's kind of, you know, rather than being kind of official museum world people, we are people who really care about and are proud of our city and want to tell that story outwardly. And I think we're fortunate that it does really come across. And, you know, it is, this engaging with the community is an interesting thing. And I kind of, you know, what does community engagement look like for yourselves?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, first of all, it's being really practical. What does community engagement look like when you've got sort of 8 million people to engage with? You know, and so, yeah, we're very lucky. We're a big museum. We have a lot of resource, but you'll never have enough resource to do that type of engagement. So one of the things that I think it's about being very clear about, in my mind, it's being very clear about the nature of the engagement. And it seems to me that there, you break it down into there's the sort of broadcast engagement, and there's the sort of very targeted stuff. And so, you know, let's say, in our case, a very interesting project we're doing with dementia sufferers. is in my mind a very, it's massively important, but it will never reach thousands and thousands of people. It's important because it's important for those people, and it's important for us as an institution because it means that we learn a lot about what our persona is and becomes, and how we respond to people. And then I'm increasingly interested in things that are what I would call engagement on engagement through almost just being populist. So you know, there's a so your programming being aware of the fact that your programming needs to be accessible and so, for instance, we did a very interesting piece of work 2 years ago when we collected a fatberg, and it was fascinating because it was
You
great.
explain to everyone what fatberg was in
Oh,
case.
sorry. Yeah. For people who don't know what a fatberg is, and you can look it up because from 2012, I believe, it entered the Oxford English Dictionary.
Okay.
Because in 2012, 2013, there was a huge blockage in the sewage system somewhere around Wimbledon, I believe. And that was the first time that the term fatberg was used. Fatberg is basically when lots and lots of fat and baby wipes and lots of other things get stuck together in a sewer, and they block the sewer so much that the whole thing gets blocked up. We collected about 2 years ago, a little bit more. We heard from Thames Water, who were the water company, that there was a big blockage in Whitechapel near the museum. And we said, well, actually, let's collect this fatberg for the collection, because it absolutely talks to today. It talks to the society we're living, the throwaway society. It talks to so many issues about climate change, about, you know, everything you want to talk about. Of course, easier said than done. It took a long, it was very complicated. I won't go into the details, but it was very complicated. I had to do risk assessments that I never thought I would have to do, including I even had one of my director colleagues at one stage, who was responsible for the safety of the museum, said to me, "I'm sorry, I'm pulling the plug on this because some of your people have just put in a risk assessment that says there's a risk of death if someone gets cut from, Anyway, long story short, we got it in. And I suppose the reason I'm saying this in the context of engagement is that we got that on display very quickly. And it captured the imagination. It was the most popular display we had done in the last 20 years. And it was really small. It was basically a chunk of fatberg and a display and a film with it. And we had people queuing around the block to come to that. And so I suppose from as a content director for me, it means that, so if you look more broadly at your content, first of all, and take I say populist by populist, I don't mean
you mean accessible.
It's accessible. You're right. It's accessible. You suddenly get a new audience, and that's great. And I think there's something about not just. I think for me, accessibility goes right through from the customer care through to the stuff that you collect, and being open enough to think, well, actually, this is relevant and appropriate. And I suppose lastly, the thing for me that the third bit of that is about and museums like yours and mine can do this, and that is giving weight to the lived experience. To say that if you have lived in an area for a long time, if you do have a specialist knowledge just by living your life, and that is a real it's a real expertise that we in the museum may or may not have. If you come from, let's say, a different cultural background, that perhaps we don't have those sorts of our antennae aren't out in the museum for those things, then so it's also about one of the things I've been quite interested in is how you engage with people's lived experience and bring that either within the museum in the context of staff that you have who have a broader range of skills, or else have an open relationship with your public, so that they feel they can engage with you, and they know that you won't they know that you'll take them seriously.
And I think living in a city as multicultural as, say, London or Dublin in more recent years, you really, it almost becomes a HR consideration in terms of making sure that you do actually have a staff and have a board that are representative of different aspects of lived experience within a city. I know that's something that you're actually, as an organisation, doing a body of work around.
Yeah, we've been running this program for the last 2.5 years that we call Curating London. It was a separately funded stream of work, which we were lucky enough to acquire. And it I suppose this thing that I just said about lived experience was the core idea. And so where I started from was that I felt that our curatorial department, and I'm a curator by background, so I'm very much part of this myself. Our curatorial departments were brilliant, massively knowledgeable, and had incredible depth of experience, but there were they reflected a particular time, a particular place, a university educated staff, and increasingly, from a diverse point of view, very few Black curators in the profession in the UK, and that's fine. But when you come to a city that is getting to the stage where you're virtually 50% Black and ethnic minority, so it's not a minority at all. This is untenable. And so I suppose for me, there was some quite clear things that we set out to do. We said, well, actually, let's really, from a HR point of view, let's really unpick what it is the curator is, what this particular role is. Not every curator, because, if you wanted a specialist in medieval jewelry, then you do expect someone who has a background in medieval jewelry. If you're looking to some of our specialists who are essentially 20th and 21st century historians of city life, then when you start to open that up and you say, well, maybe you don't need a PhD, maybe you don't need, and suddenly you start to open it up, and you have people who are artists, photographers, people coming from perhaps quite different backgrounds, who begin to start to get a new body of people in, and it's early days, but we have made a significant shift in the people who we're employing. That isn't to say that, at the end of the day, my view on this is that, I'm not bringing someone in to be not a curator. Everyone who works with us are curators. It's just their specialisms are different, and I think that's that is necessary for us, because I say, as I say to people, it's not just a sort of wouldn't it be nice to have. It's business critical. If we're to as a publicly funded body keep the support of the public, then we have to be seen, rightly so, to represent and to look like the rest of the citizens in the city.
Yeah, you have to be truly part of the community. And I think I'm kind of just curious as you're talking there. So when you're talking about the role of the different curators that you have, when you're approaching this idea of the lived experience versus, say, a conventional artifact or an object, is the way that you approach them both from a curatorial point of view the same or different?
It's very interesting, because your collection, like mine, and this is terrible, isn't it? We this is what museum people do. They do. It's my collection. Of course, it's not my collection, but that's what we do. We this stuff feels like ours, doesn't it? And I guess that's the nice thing, is because we are custodians for a time, and then we pass it on to someone else. Anyway, so that's a slight aside.
No,
I think the nature of our collections are that they are very broad, and they move from what would be almost considered fine and decorative arts through to some quite ephemeral collections, and so within that, I'm lucky in the sense within my museum that because of that, there are many different sort of collections that we have. We have oral history collections, we have film collections, we have photography, and so some of them are perhaps more traditional in the sense that we describe, and some aren't. So there is more of an opportunity in our case to broaden the net around the sort of specialisms that you might expect people to have. And I think the other thing is that you have to sort of ultimately make a decision around saying, how many deep subject specialists do we have, or how many, and I use the term advisedly, generalists do we have? And I think in my time, we're certainly moving, we're not getting rid of specialists, but by any manner of means, because I think they're hugely important. But you cannot have all deep specialists. You have to have people who can sort of look a bit broader. And oftentimes the issue with curators, and as I said, I come from that background myself, is that oftentimes curators are very good at looking at their own area, but they're not brilliant at making a link to another area. And people who come from a different perspective, sometimes when they're a bit further back, they say, oh, okay, oh, so that's right. So you've got photographs about these things, and you've got a whole thing around all these other things here. Supposing you did something that brought them all together. And that's why you end up doing more thematic collecting, more thematic work. So we've just done a sort of a quite a big program around thematic collecting around COVID in London, and that's been really interesting and my curators really liked it because you were suddenly not typically museums, large museums like ours, curators tend to be, they look after their collection. So if you're a fashion and textiles curator, you will be looking after that material. But so, for instance, you might be looking at so you might be collecting all the face masks, and maybe all the fabric comes into the to the fashion and textile curator, and suddenly they're having conversations with the curators who are out there and sort of looking at the doing some filming or speaking to people, or as we have a youth curator who did a really interesting project with young people in lockdown during Ramadan, and so she's getting them to keep. So suddenly you have all your curators together, and you're beginning. This is the type of thing that I came from a much smaller museum background. And smaller museums are so much better at interdisciplinarity. Larger museums get sort of intellectually constipated and can't sort of move themselves to make the best use of the resources they have. So you're sort of at one level it's very simple. At one level you're trying to make every museum like the little museum. It's that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think it's a very different experience. I think kind of the scale and the level of communication at a museum of your scale. Like I know, if I want to sit down with each of my kind of key colleagues who are kind of part of the decision-making process, you can send a text and go, let's get onto a FaceTime in 10 minutes time, and suddenly you've everyone on screen. And that's it's been our experience quite a lot in the last couple of months. But I think kind of when you mention COVID there, it is it's interesting to hear that you are collecting around it. And like, what is the landscape like in London for the museum sector at the moment?
It's a bit grim, I'll be absolutely honest. The larger museums have reopened. A lot of the smaller museums, I was just in a meeting today with colleagues across the sector in London, and a lot of the smaller museums haven't reopened at all. Some museums that are part of the local authority network are have have lots of other things that the priorities are different in the local authority. And independent museums, a number of them are very, very close to the edge. And there are financial challenges all across the board. So that's looking internally, I suppose. But I suppose on the other hand, museums are also, a number of museums are also trying to work out what this means. This is an unprecedented experience we're living through, and I would like to feel that we were at least as good as our predecessors in the London Museum back at the end of the First World War. Did a contemporary collecting project around women's workwear, because clearly the curator director at the time was able to see that suddenly there was all this stuff happening. Who were all these women out on doing all these jobs, and they actively collected uniforms from women at that stage. Now that's really that's like gemstones to us now. Those collections, the collections that we made, some of the contemporary collections that were made during times of crisis by my museum and lots of other museums in the past, have, you're laying down stuff for the future. And I think that's why I think lots of museums are looking at how they can capture this. And so much of it is quite at one level, it's obviously all out there because it's all digital, but then it's a sort of an internal process. And that's why I was early on, it just shows that nobody listens to me at my work, because my early suggestion was that we did a project around diaries, because of course there was the mass observation movement, very much based on diaries, and a lot of what we know around London was that. I was told by my colleagues that there's an awful lot of that going on with the digital world that we're in, which is a fair point. But that being said, we have circled around to it, and we're doing some quite close, as I was saying earlier on about the younger people who are keeping their own records. So there's the physical stuff that you're collecting, which is the stuff that, again, it all seems it's everywhere at the moment, but it's the sort of the paraphernalia that comes with that, with protecting yourself from COVID. Then there's the sort of, we sent someone out on a bicycle during the early days of lockdown, filmed all the empty streets, which was really nice. And we've also done a very nice recording. Back in 1928, I mean, the things that happened. Back in 1928, there was a series of recordings made of points around London, Leicester Square, whatever, because it was a campaign that was run by I think the Standard or the Evening News, maybe, at the time, that London, everyone was saying, oh my gosh, London is so busy and so noisy. They specifically made a whole series of recordings to show how dreadfully busy all the traffic in 1928 was. So in 2018, we actually went around and did recordings of all those same areas. And then we actually sent people out now during lockdown. We sent the curators out again, and they recorded in all those spaces again. So trying to do just not, there'll be lots of images around, there'll be lots of things there, but it's trying to second guess, as the case with all contemporary collecting, trying to second guess what will be really interesting and important in 40 years' time, is sort of one of the things we're working on.
Because it's an interesting idea, even when you were kind of mentioning your the predecessing director who was collecting kind of female attire at the end of the First World War. From a curatorial point of view, does the quality of the collections that we end up with differ much, or is there any kind of distinct changes between something that's collected retrospectively versus when it's active?
It's a really interesting question, and my instinct tells me that is that you, when you have an opportunity to collect at the time, you should do it. Now, what I've been in the lucky situation that I've been able to put several curators on this project at this stage, and one of the first things I wanted them to do was to give me a rationale for why they were collecting what they were collecting, because in a way, because that's what you get by doing it contemporaneously rather than retrospectively. You can actively think about it and now what it. I would never think, and there's this whole world around contemporary collecting versus non. And I know back in the day, the Scandinavians had this entire sort of national project around contemporary collecting. I think the danger with going too much into that is that you lose the serendipity, and you lose, and it becomes a bit processy, and you lose the connoisseurship that is there. But I'll give you an interesting example though of why I think some contemporary collecting is worth thinking about. We did an exercise in Finsbury Park 18 months ago, and I was really intrigued. I had a lot of brilliant archaeologists that I've worked with over the years, and I've been really impressed by the way archaeology is starting to go, where people are not digging holes in the ground, but they're starting to take those skills and say, what does that tell us about the world we're living in? And we did this really interesting project where we took a Finsbury Park, which is a big London park. It's bordered by 3 or 4 different boroughs. And every borough has a slightly different policy. And so their bylaws are interesting because so how you treat things like sleeping rough is different. And so what we did was we got our very young, very funny young team, and they treated it. They said, let's do contemporary archaeology. And they did the classic archaeology thing. They pegged it out. They did the whole thing, and they collected the detritus of an ordinary everyday day in the park. And I was like, with my registrars and conservators were sort of left with the challenge of saying, well, are we really collecting all this rubbish? Or, is this really what we're coming into? And then and furthermore, in the recesses of the park, are we, what are we going to do when we come across drugs paraphernalia, things like that? And so what you get is you take our classic skills as curators, as archaeologists, as historians, and you apply them in a systematic way, and suddenly you get something that's a really interesting account. And one of the things that I think is probably one of the most interesting was that when you do a dig, you end up with a report, and so we have this very intriguing report, which I think will give a nuance and a flavour and a texture to Finsbury Park in 40 years' time that you would never get without it. So it's great, but if you're going to do it, I think you need to do it scientifically, because otherwise it's just your connoisseurship, just like anything else. So yeah, that's sort of my general view about how you do contemporary collecting and its value.
It's interesting. It's one of my favourite recent additions to our collection is a collection of broken and kind of disused tennis balls that have been abandoned by the dogs of South County Dublin on the of the waterfront out in Dunleary.
Brilliant.
Which we've got a beautiful display in the ground floor of the museum now. And every time I see it, it makes me smile. And it is, you just know, every ball has a story. But I think there was a sentence that you said to me earlier this week that kind of links into what we're talking about here. And speaking of dogs, mine is complaining at the door. I apologize if you can hear that. When you and I were talking earlier on this week, and we were talking about this idea of what people's museums were, what city museums were, you had said, and I wrote down here, that one of the challenges that organisations like ours have is that we're not alike the V&A, that we're not fine art museums, that instead we are very much inherently modest in our subject matter because we deal with the human.
Yeah.
Would you talk to me about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I like the idea of modesty, and it goes back to what I was saying about the entrance, the welcome, and I think if you take as your starting point that, you know, social history museums that and most city museums tend to be social history museums, that you're talking about people's lives and people's experiences, then it automatically takes you into a discourse that feels different to the. And I'm a great. I go to V&A all the time. You know, I'm not having to go to V&A at all, but the sort of more, I suppose, the more fine art or the applied art type gallery, where you're going there to appreciate, you know, the beauty and the craftsmanship of the object. Some of our best objects are very modest. So one of the things that I think that we have is that I just you know, love is we have a wedding dress. You know, everyone gets wedding dresses. You turning wedding dresses away, but it's a wedding dress that was worn by 6 different people during the 1940s, and they were all related, and it was all passed on because it was make to amend, and it was all like that. It's not a particularly beautiful dress, but it's a heartwarming story. So it's a modest object, is what I'm saying. And there is a you know, and once you take that approach, it instinctively takes you away from the heroic story. It you know, and it puts the ordinary on a plinth. The downside of that for museums is that when you're doing displays and exhibitions and whatever, oftentimes interpreting these things is hard. And how you guys have done it really well is through the one-to-one, through the guide, through the story, through that, and I think that's the challenge for our type of museum, is that how do you enthuse people with the sort of the modest but yet amazing stuff that we have.
But it's the amazingly human. Like we've had this conversation a number of times, that how do we curate and present an exhibition that you walk out of feeling a sense of wonder and inspired and engaged and enjoyed, but that you haven't seen one famous quote unquote name throughout the entire exhibition. And I think that is, it's something that's entirely within remits of organizations like ours, and probably not much further outside of that. I see a question has just come up here from a woman wondering if you are a Cork man.
Oh, well, no, sadly I have to come clean and admit that I am. No. I like lots of people from. I'm a 1980s generation that sort of rode out the recession, first of all in University College Cork, and then came to London and never went back. So yeah, absolutely. It's sort of it is interesting because I oftentimes think that I'm lucky that I'm of the generation that didn't have to lose your accent or any of those things. I think there's a particular London Irish accent from a generation before me, where people felt the need to modify the way they spoke or whatever. And I've been very lucky to be here during this time, when it's been okay to be Irish, I guess.
Which is, and I think that idea of identity in London is something that is actually quite topical at the moment. Like I know you mentioned in passing the other day that a statue outside one of your museums has actually just recently been taken down.
Yeah. So this is a man called Robert Milligan. Milligan was a very important character in establishing the West India Docks, which was one of the first closed docks in London. Very wealthy man, but obviously what was never sort of picked up in the past was that he was also a slaver, and so there was a statue of Robert Milligan stood just a few meters away from our museum in Docklands. We, although we didn't own the museum, we didn't own the object, it actually it sat very uncomfortably with us. And in fact, in many we had done a number of interventions over the years where we sort of brought it into our discussions. But interestingly, during the Black Lives Matter, all of the issues that happened earlier on this year, there was a sort of a campaign run within Tower Hamlets, specifically around this. The mayor of Tower Hamlets was very keen that something be done about it, and it all got it was a very publicly discussed thing, and rolled out in real time. Canal and River Trust, who owned the object, decided to take it down. We were quite supportive of that. But interestingly, I mean, the question, taking it away is just, there's now the absence of the object. And we're part of a discussion that's happening with the local community and around what might happen to it. There is people automatically say, "Oh, put it in a museum." Now, putting a great big sculpture into a museum it's interesting, but you can only do it in the context of how are you going to contextualize that object. I'm almost more interested in the empty plinth and how that plinth might be redisplayed or rethought of. So it is it's a very live issue in London, rightly so. And I think the issues of how we approach our sort of public heritage is massively important, because London, and to be fair, I'm sure lots of Dublin, benefited hugely from the wealth of the slave trade. Even if we're not talking about individual slavers, there was huge amount of wealth in London came into London as a result of it. And so physically there was still a manifestation of that in a lot of the lovely Georgian squares that exist today.
And like, even say, like, it's interesting that you guys were brought into the discussion around the current Black Lives Matter movement by the fact that the statue was so close to, if not on, your kind of museum environment. But say, taking a step back in the situation where there was no direct connection, such as a statue, to be discussed, Do you think museums like yourselves and ourselves actually have a role to play during movements like that?
I think we specifically do, because the building within which that outside of which it stood is an old warehouse, and it's the West India Quays. Okay. So the wealth of, there was a very clear link between sugar and slavery, and we actually have a gallery within that museum called London Sugar and Slavery. I absolutely believe that museums. If museums are, if our job is, which is about talking about history and talking about our culture as it is, and it seems to me inconceivable that we should sidestep a matter as important as this. It's complicated. It's not easy, and I'm not at all suggesting that one one goes in there knowing any answers. But I think museums have they can't take for granted the fact that people sort of will keep coming to them. As our audiences are changing, as society is changing, as we're moving away, moving to a much more questioning society, then we become an institution. We become the establishment. And heavens knows there's lots of discussions around the establishment at the moment. And I personally don't think that the museum sector needs to be in that. It badly needs not to be in that bucket. It needs to be out there, open and willing to discuss things. And so that's challenging. There are all the issues around ownership, all the issues around colonial loot, all of those sorts of things. They're all there, and they're all very real. But I think museums need to engage with them.
Because I think it's an interesting idea, and especially when we are at a moment in time where I think we as a sector are finding this current pandemic financially really troubling, and it will inevitably negatively impact the landscape of what the museum sector looks like at the end of it. But, does the kind of the future of the world of museums, is it to be taken for granted, or are we fighting for our survival as a sector, do you think?
Really interesting question, because there's something that I call the Tate factor, because I've worked in the museum sector here for over 20 years, certainly the art museums have this amazingly popular sort of run. So the fact that the Tate has the sort of crowd control problems that London Underground has is quite amazing, actually. But I suppose my cautionary sort of thought to that is, I used to, in the 90s, I ran a local museum in North London, but it was also part of a libraries department, and I had a lot of dealings with libraries, and I have a huge time for libraries. But if you look at the challenge that libraries faced, from there being a time when libraries were there was no question about the importance of libraries, and there was this existential crisis in the sort of 80s and 90s, and public libraries have been redefining themselves, but goodness knows they've had to do a lot of work on that. I think museums have done really well this last 20 years, but I don't think we should take that for granted. And I think there's some really interesting stuff happening. This is why this thing about the trust that we have as being, comes right back to the stuff I'm quite obsessing about at the moment, which is that if we're not legitimate, if we're not seen to be legitimate, then actually, we shouldn't take any of this for granted. So yeah, I think personally, I think there's always even more in the digital age, there's a need for the real. Collections are great, museums are real things, but actually, if you're seen to be part of an elite, an establishment, then it might be that in these times we're in, you could very quickly start to lose that sort of baseline support that we take for granted.
You lose the relevance in some sorts. And I think the kind of final topic I want to ask you about is, I guess, the future of the museum itself. Like, I know you have what is kind of publicly regarded as one of the kind of largest expansion move projects on the horizon. You might tell us what the future looks like.
Yeah, very briefly. I mean, we're planning to move from our current site on London Wall, which is by the Barbican, to a site in Smithfield, which is the old market, and it's the old general market. It's an old Smithfield has been a market for 1,000 years. There's an amazing opportunity for us to redefine what the museum is. It is a mega capital project, and I mean it's our eye-watering figures, but you know it's a 337 million pound project, which is about redeveloping the entire area, of which the museum is core. So I'm quick to say we're not spending 337 million pounds on a museum as such, but it is a mega project. It's hugely important for us, and it gives us a chance to. So what we're doing is we're deconstructing the way we're looking at the narrative, and we're saying we break it down into temporal areas, and we're saying you come into our time, which is living memory. You then go to see sort of past time, which is the more narrative. You have another area that we're calling deep time, which is our collections. And then finally, we have what we were saying at the beginning, future time, imagined time. So the idea of looking at the story of the city through many, many different lenses. And it's an opportunity that we have in a completely new, in a sort of a different type of building than our current lovely museum, but it is a stumble through for 4 hours if you're to read everything from start to finish. And this is, I guess, more of its time. It is a more of an approach where you break up the stories and into different the content into different, and there are different ways in for different audiences. To a very early point,
okay,
you could imagine different audiences in different areas.
And it's an amazing thing. Like I've spent many hours in your museum and enjoyed every moment of it. But it is very much, as you said, it's a very full-on, kind of very rewarding experience. But that idea of being able to have different visits based on the experience that you as the attendee wish to have that day is an amazing and an exciting prospect. Like, what's your timeline on?
So we are planning to be opening on site in 2024. So it's and we're still sticking to that deadline. You know, COVID or not, we're still working on it. So it's a bit challenging, as you can imagine, working in lockdown. But we are in the midst of design development for some of our pastime galleries at the moment, and we're rolling on.
But it's quite a statement from the government to actually put a museum as the anchor at the heart of a project, which is kind of regenerating an area.
It's an important statement. Our major funders are the City of London Corporation and the Mayor of London, and there's a very clear, and they're very clear that it links with a major new Crossrail station. So the Crossrail is the sort of the everyone gives out about it, but it's the big infrastructure rail project, and it is in itself going to shift the centre of London further east, and it means that we, in a sense, will be the new Covent Garden. I would hope. I say that advisedly because Covent Garden has become very, very sort of posh these days. I think I would like us to feel that we're like the early Covent Garden, quite gritty and very, very, very sort of bustly and busy. But that's the sort of context within which we will be operating.
It's a very evocative description. I've immediately got a sense of the feel and the experience, and you know what it might look like in future. And 4 years from now, I really can't wait to experience it. And
you're being very welcome. I'll give you the guided tour.
I will definitely take you up on that. It's incredibly, we are out of time at this stage. Finbarr, I'd have sat here all evening and continued chatting. I think you're an absolutely wonderful and fascinating person. So thank you so much for being here this evening and for being so generous with the stories that you've been sharing.
It's my absolute pleasure. I said at the beginning, and I mean it genuinely. I think your museum is just amazing, and so I think we have a huge amount to learn from you as well.
I think we as a sector will always support each other, and I think we've very much valued your support over the years. But I guess that is bizarrely it for this evening. I thank you so much. So to everyone else, we will see you again next week. And for now, Finbarr, thank you again for your time, and good evening, everybody.
My pleasure. Cheers now.